My brother forged our dad's will to leave me with nothing, then smirked and told me maybe I had just imagined it. I could only stare at him in disbelief. That was a year ago, and this morning he stood outside the courthouse in shackles, finally, facing the consequences of his lies. Imagine waking up to a nightmare. Your own brother, the one you grew up with, has completely betrayed you. He didn't just break your heart. He shattered your family, forged your dying father's will, and tried to leave you with absolutely nothing. What followed was a fight for my life, my sanity, and the truth, leading to a confrontation that would leave one of us utterly broken. It all started last year, when my dad passed away. It ripped me apart. He was my rock, the one parent who always had my back. My older brother, Dan, he's 38. And yeah, some relatives always saw him as the golden child. Charming as hell, could talk his way out of anything. But I always knew that charm came with a side of manipulative lies. I knew he was selfish, sure, but I never imagined he'd sink to this level. Turns out I seriously underestimated him. Dan had been playing these games since we were kids. I'm talking money missing from Mom's purse. He'd swear I took it, and Mom would believe him. Later, the cash would turn up in his room, but I'd already been grounded. Or when I was a teenager, Dad bought me a used laptop for school. A week later, gone. Poof. Months later, I found out Dan had sold it to a friend for quick cash. His excuse? You weren't using it enough, and I needed the money more than you. Dad would scold him, sure, but he never really cut him off. I think he just kept hoping Dan would, grow up. Spoiler alert, he didn't. Now, before Dad died, he told me about his will. He was clear. Everything split equally between me and Dan except for the house. He wanted me to have the house. I'd been living there, taking care of him in the place for years, but after the funeral, Dan started getting shifty about paperwork. Oh, you don't need to stress about the legal stuff. I'll handle it. That was my first huge red flag. A few weeks later, Dan hands over Dad's will to the lawyer. And let me tell you, my stomach dropped. This will said everything. Everything. The house, the savings, even Dad's cherished coin collection, it all went to Dan. The only thing I supposedly got? Some emotional keepsake. A watch worth maybe $50. When I questioned it, Dan just smirked. Oh, don't tell me you actually thought Dad wanted you to have the house, he sneered. You're always so dramatic. Dad knew you couldn't handle big responsibilities. When I told him Dad had said the exact opposite, he just shrugged. Memories aren't proof. Maybe you imagined it. That, maybe you imagined it, line. My blood didn't just boil, it incinerated. It was classic Dan trying to gaslight me, make me doubt myself so I'd just give up. But not this time. I told the lawyer right there, I am not convinced. Dan rolled his eyes, muttered to the lawyer, She's just trying to start trouble. It's embarrassing. But thankfully, this lawyer took me seriously. She had the will examined. And surprise, the signature, a total forgery, the date on the will, it was dated after Dad had already passed away. When I confronted Dan about it, he actually laughed. Fine, you caught me, he said, like we were playing a game. But you really think a judge will care? Families settle these things privately all the time. If you take me to court, you'll just waste money and look petty. That was it. That was the moment. Court it is. Dan strutted into court like he was untouchable, like he was the victim. He spread lies to anyone who'd listen, calling me a greedy little sister who couldn't accept Dad loved him more. During his testimony, he just kept smirking at me, daring me to beat him. But the evidence? It spoke for itself. We had a forensic handwriting expert, the glaringly mismatched dates, even text messages where Dan literally complained to a friend about having to redo the will after Dad died. The judge didn't just rule in my favor. She tore into Dan, calling his actions deliberate, deceitful, and malicious. She ordered all assets divided exactly as Dad's real will stipulated. So, I got the house, my share of the savings, and all Dad's personal items. But here's the kicker. Forging a will isn't just bad manners, it's a crime. The court slapped Dan with massive legal fees and restitution costs. By the time it was all over, he had to sell his own home to pay off what he owed. The charming, smooth-talking Dan, who always got away with everything. Now he's living in a tiny rented apartment, no savings, no property, and his reputation in the family, utterly destroyed. A month later, he actually called to make peace. His version of peace, of course, was me handing him money to get back on his feet. I told him, "You wanted everything, remember? Now you have exactly what you earned, nothing." And I hung up. But then last night, something else happened. I went to log into my online banking and my password didn't work. After finally resetting it and getting in, my stomach dropped. Every single account was empty. My savings, my checking, even the emergency fund I kept separate. All gone. Over $300,000 just vanished overnight. I called the bank immediately, but their fraud department was closed until morning. I didn't sleep a wink, just sat there, staring at the screen, refreshing the page like the money might somehow magically reappear. At 7 a.m. sharp, I was literally banging on the bank's door as they opened. The manager took one look at my accounts and called the police herself. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in a small, cold room at the FBI field office, talking to Special Agent James Wright about wire fraud. Agent Wright slid a folder across the table. Inside were transcripts of messages between Dan and someone named Roy, going back 3 months. They were talking about me, calling me the sister problem, discussing something they called the final solution to their money troubles. James explained the FBI had been watching Dan since the civil trial. They suspected he'd do something desperate, but they just hadn't moved fast enough to stop him from emptying my accounts. I signed papers, letting them monitor my phone and email, just in case. James said they needed to sweep Dad's house. If Dan was desperate enough to steal $300,000, who knew what other surprises he might have left? 2 days later, the tech team made some chilling discoveries. Keystroke logging software on my home computer, recording every single password I typed for months, and a GPS tracker stuck under my car. Dan had been watching my every move. I had to hire a cybersecurity expert to clean everything, staying in a downtown hotel while my life felt like it was spiraling. Then Tom Bradley called. Tom was Dad's best friend, like an uncle to me. Marcus, my lawyer, had told him what happened. Tom said Dad had shown him the real will 6 months before he died because he was worried Dan might try something. Tom had a notarized copy in his safe deposit box. I drove straight to his house. He handed me the will and a letter Dad had written. My father had known about Dan's gambling debts, how he owed money to dangerous people, how scared Dad was, that Dan would do something desperate for cash. Dad had known. He tried to protect me, but it just wasn't enough. More bad news came from Rachel Torres, the forensic accountant Marcus hired. She'd found 3 different bank accounts opened, in my name over the past year, all using documents Dan stole from Dad's house during the funeral. Each one set up to make the theft look like I was just moving my own money around. A week after the theft, I finally went back to Dad's house with a police escort. Everything looked normal, but the whole place felt wrong, like Dan's toxic presence was still clinging to the walls. In Dad's study, I found his journal, hidden behind some old books. Page after page, Dad had documented everything. Every time Dan asked for money, every lie, every manipulation, going back 20 years. My father had been keeping track of it all. Then my phone rang. Blocked number. It was Dan. His voice was cold, flat. "You should have just accepted the watch," he said. "Now that you've involved the feds, everything's changed. You have no idea who I owe money to." He hung up before I could even respond, but the FBI had recorded the call. The next day, James played back the enhanced audio. I see another bias. Background, casino sounds. Someone announcing Table 43. The FBI's gambling task force identified it immediately, a specific illegal casino in Chicago, tied to organized crime. That's when James sat me down and explained the terrifying truth. Dan owed over $800,000 to a brutal crime syndicate that ran illegal gambling operations across the Midwest. He'd been using Dad's death, the inheritance, as collateral to buy himself more time. when he lost the civil case and had to pay me restitution? His timeline snapped. He got desperate. Marcus called me that same afternoon. He was filing emergency motions to freeze any assets Dan might have hidden. The FBI started working with organized crime units in Chicago. Sitting in Marcus's office, watching him make calls, fill out paperwork, it finally hit me. This wasn't just about a forged will anymore. Dan had dragged us both into something far, far more dangerous. He had put both our lives on the line. 3 days later, Rachel called again with more devastating news. She'd found a shell company Dan created, using Dad's old business contacts as references. He'd been moving money through it for 2 years, long before Dad even got sick. Rachel went through all the records. Dan had stolen over $1.2 million total from different family members and some of Dad's former clients. Fake investments, bogus loans, even selling property that wasn't his. He'd been running schemes on all of them. Marcus set me up with a therapist who specialized in family financial abuse. I didn't want to go, but he insisted it would help with the case. She was kind, explaining that Dan's behavior was pathological, not personal. His gambling addiction, she said, made him see everyone as potential money sources, not as people. Understanding it didn't make me feel any better about what he'd done, though. The next morning, Linda from the bank called with urgent news. Dan had shown up at the branch trying to get into Dad's safe deposit box, the one Dad left me. He had forged documents claiming he was the estate's executor. Security recognized him from Linda's alerts, and when they called the police, Dan bolted, just ran out the back door and disappeared. The FBI issued an arrest warrant immediately. My brother was now officially a fugitive. James called, telling me to come to the police station right away. When I got there, they explained the FBI had intercepted messages. Members of the crime syndicate were talking about using me to get to Dan. They were putting me under protective custody. Right then. 2 federal marshals would be stationed at Dad's house, where I was still living. My normal life? Completely gone. A week later, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the motion sensors at Dad's house blared. The marshals caught a man trying to break in through the back door. It wasn't Dan, but someone the syndicate had sent to leave a message. They searched him and found photos of me, going to work, shopping, sitting in my car at a red light. A whole list of places I went, times I was usually there. The FBI moved me to a secure apartment the very next day. While they kept looking for Dan, James sat me down. He explained they were treating this as full organized crime involvement now. It changed everything. Dan had crossed lines that put us both in serious danger. They were bringing in federal resources to deal with it. My world had shrunk to 4 walls and constant fear. Stuck in that safe house, I had nothing but time to go through Dad's things the marshals brought. I found his journal. I started reading. More carefully, and my heart just broke. Entries going back years, about Dad trying to get Dan help for his gambling problem. Dad had paid for rehab twice, bailed him out of debt more times than I could count. His last entry, it said he'd enabled Dan for too long, and that the will was his last desperate attempt to protect me from my brother's never-ending problems. Rachel kept digging, tracking down everything Dan had stolen. She found out he'd been selling family heirlooms and Dad's collectibles through black market dealers for months. Dad's coin collection, worth $200,000, he'd sold for a measly $20,000 to a dealer in Detroit. That dealer eventually agreed to work with the FBI for immunity. About 2 weeks into my safe house confinement, Tom visited. He brought boxes of documents Dad had asked him to hold on to years ago. As we went through them, we found records Dan had stolen from our grandparents' estate 15 years earlier. Dad had covered it up to protect the family's reputation, to keep Dan out of jail. The pattern of his deceit went back so much further than any of us had ever realized. 3 days later, my secure phone buzzed with an FBI alert. My hand started shaking. Dan had sent an email from an encrypted account. The subject line, "You owe me." The message was short, chilling. He knew where I was. The marshals couldn't protect me forever, and if I didn't wire him $500,000 within 72 hours, his problems would become my problems permanently. My blood ran cold. James called within minutes, already tracing the email to a cyber cafe in Indiana. But by the time state police got there, Dan was long gone. Security footage showed him leaving with a blonde woman in her 40s, someone he'd met in an online gambling support group. She'd been helping him hide for weeks, moving him between motels, using her credit cards to keep him off the grid. Another victim of Dan's charm. Marcus arrived at the safe house the next morning with a stack of legal documents and a grim face. They were building a RICO case now. This wasn't just theft. It was organized fraud, money laundering, extortion. Charges that could put Dan away for 20 years or more. And despite everything he'd done, some tiny part of me still saw that. Broken older brother who used to sneak me candy when mom said no. 2 weeks later, we were in federal court for a preliminary hearing to freeze Dan's hidden assets. His lawyer tried to negotiate, presenting this ridiculous deal. Dan would return half the stolen money if all charges were dropped. Judge Hayes actually laughed out loud before denying it and adding obstruction of justice to Dan's rapidly growing list of charges. That afternoon, James pulled me aside in the courthouse hallway. He dropped another bomb. The FBI's organized crime unit had been building a case against Dan's creditors for years. My brother's theft had given them the perfect opening. They offered me full witness protection if I'd testify, but that would mean leaving everything behind. New name, new city, nobody knowing me. I spent the next 3 weeks in that safe house, agonizing over what to do. Then, at 2 a.m., my secure phone rang. Unknown number. It was Dan. He was sobbing so hard I could barely understand him. He kept repeating, "They're going to kill me. 48 hours, or they'll start cutting. Pieces off me." Before I could even respond, I heard shouting in the background, a sickening thud of something heavy hitting flesh, and then the line went dead. The FBI traced the call to a warehouse in Gary, Indiana. A tactical team was there within 2 hours. They found blood on the concrete floor, signs of a struggle. Lab confirmed it was Dan's DNA, but he was gone. No other trace. James was brutally blunt when he called with the update. Dan was either already dead or wishing he was. These people didn't play games. For 3 agonizing days, I heard nothing. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Just sat there, ripped between the anger at what he'd done and raw terror about what was happening to him. The marshals tried to distract me, but I kept checking my phone, praying for a ransom demand, dreading a call saying they'd found his body. Then Rachel called with unexpected news. She'd found $300,000 Dan had hidden in cryptocurrency wallets under fake names. She was working with the FBI to recover it. She thought it might be enough to keep Dan alive, if his creditors were willing to negotiate. 5 days after he disappeared, Dan surfaced. In a hospital in Detroit. Beaten so badly, the doctor said it was a miracle he was conscious. He'd traded information about his creditor's entire operation for his life. Names, addresses, account numbers, everything they needed to take down the whole network. James flew me to Detroit under heavy guard. He said this was my one chance to see Dan before he entered witness protection permanently. The hospital reeked of bleach and fear. James had 2 agents flanking me, hands near their weapons, as we walked through the sterile halls. Room 412. Inside, machines beeped steadily. Dan lay in the bed, his face a swollen mass of purple and black. One eye completely shut. Lips split in 3 places, bandages wrapped around his ribs. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough, cracked. The words hung heavy in the air between us as I stared at the IV dripping into his arm, at the handcuffs, chaining him to the bed rail. He started talking then, slowly at first, about how he'd planned everything, even before Dad's heart surgery, seeing it as his only way to pay off the $300,000 he owed to people who broke fingers for missed payments. His voice cracked again as he admitted practicing Dad's signature for weeks before Dad even died, copying it from old checks until it was perfect. My hands gripped the chair arms so hard my knuckles went white. Dan shifted painfully, pulled out his phone. "I recorded everything," he rasped, showing me audio files. "For insurance." The FBI tech specialist took the phone, played the recordings right there in the room. Voices discussing which judge they owned in Milwaukee, how they'd made another debtor disappear in Lake Michigan, the politicians they had on payroll. James's eyes went wide as name after name came through that tiny speaker. A week later, I was in a safe house conference room. Marcus spread legal documents across the table, explaining how Dan's cooperation probably meant 12 years instead of 25. But the stolen money? It was now evidence in a massive federal racketeering case. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. Marcus pointed to forms showing the money would be tied up for 3 to 5 years, minimum, while the case worked its way through the system. Tom showed up the next afternoon with a cardboard box from Dad's house. Photo albums. We flipped through them on the safe house kitchen counter. Pictures from Disney World, Dan at 10, me at 4, both of us grinning with mouse ears. Dan at his high school graduation, Dad's arm around his shoulders, both so proud. Christmas morning photos, Dan helping me open presents when I was too small. Your father loved both of you, Tom said softly, pointing at Dad teaching little Dan to ride a bike. My throat felt tight, looking at that little boy who became someone I barely recognized anymore. Marcus's phone rang at 2 a.m. 3 days later. Blocked number. It was a lawyer representing concerned parties who wanted to make a deal. They'd forgive Dan's debts and guarantee my safety if I refused to testify. The lawyer's voice was smooth, making my skin crawl. Marcus put him on speaker so James could record it. They're scared, Marcus explained after hanging up, showing me transcripts of Dan's recordings that mentioned senators, federal judges, even a police commissioner. We filed our refusal through official channels the next morning, knowing full well we'd just painted bigger targets on our backs. 6 weeks after Dan emptied my accounts, James called a press conference. 17 arrests. 2 city councilmen, a state senator's chief of staff, owners of legitimate businesses that were actually money laundering fronts. Dan's recordings had blown the whole thing wide open, giving them probable cause for search warrants that uncovered ledgers, more recordings, even a murder weapon from a 2-year-old cold case. Your brother's cooperation is unprecedented, James told me privately. Dan had given them details about 43 different crimes, including 3 murders they'd never connected to the syndicate. 7 weeks after the theft, the FBI finally cleared Dad's house. New locks, security cameras, an alarm system hooked directly to their response team. I walked through the front door, and it was like time had stopped. Dad's recliner, his coffee mug, his reading glasses on the arm of the chair, like he'd just stepped out for a minute. The faint smell of his cologne still in his bedroom. I stood in the kitchen where he'd made pancakes every Sunday, and I knew. I couldn't live here anymore. Not with everything that had happened. I called a realtor that afternoon. Dan's arraignment at the federal courthouse was a media circus. They brought him in through a side entrance, but I still saw him. Orange jumpsuit, hands and feet shackled, shuffling to the defendant's table. When the judge read the charges, Dan said guilty to each one. His voice was flat, empty. The prosecutor recommended 12 years with a possibility of 8 for continued cooperation. Dan just nodded. That evening, Rachel called with more news. She'd traced another $200,000 through Dan's shell companies, bringing the total recovered to $500,000. But then she dropped the real bombshell: life insurance policies. Dan had taken out policies on both me and Dad 18 months ago, each worth $2 million, with himself as the sole beneficiary. The highest payout required accidental death or death during a crime. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My first appointment with the FBI-recommended therapist was in a bland office downtown. I sat on a beige couch staring at a painting of a lighthouse. After 20 minutes of silence, I finally choked it out. I feel guilty for testifying against him. She adjusted her glasses, her voice gentle. Dan made his choices long before you made yours. Protecting yourself isn't betrayal. He betrayed family first. You're just refusing to be his victim. That word, victim, it stuck with me. 2 months crawled by, a blur of court dates and depositions. Then came the pretrial hearing, a cold Tuesday morning. The courtroom smelled of old wood and floor wax. Dan's gambling buddy's lawyer stood up, pointed right at me. He told the judge I was part of the whole thing, that I knew about Dan's debts, that I'd helped stage the theft for insurance money. Marcus sprang up so fast his chair scraped the floor. He pulled out folder after folder, Every email I sent the FBI, every document I gave them, timestamps proving I reported the theft within hours. The judge's face got redder with each baseless accusation until she slammed her gavel. One more claim like that, she warned, and he'd be sanctioned. 3 days later, James called. They'd caught the woman from Dan's gambling support group at the Canadian border with fake passports and $20,000 in cash. She broke down during questioning. Admitted everything. How Dan taught her to create shell companies, how he promised they'd run away together with my inheritance money, how she believed him when he said I didn't deserve it anyway. Another person Dan used and threw away like trash. The agent who interviewed her said she cried for 2 hours straight, heartbroken when she realized Dan never loved her. I started going to meetings for families of gambling addicts. Church basements downtown, terrible coffee, but stories worse than mine. Carol's brother took loans against their dying mom's house. An older man's son emptied his granddaughter's college fund on sports betting in one weekend. We sat on metal folding chairs, passing tissues, as people shared how addiction turned their loved ones into strangers who would steal anything. The support helped, but nothing prepared me for Dan's creditor's trial 6 weeks later. I sat in the witness box, describing the night those men tried to break down my door. How I hid in my bathroom with a baseball bat, shaking so hard I could barely hold it. Dan appeared on a TV screen from wherever they were hiding him. His face, thinner, older, as he listed names, dates, syndicate murders, politicians they owned, judges they bought. The defense lawyers attacked both of us, calling Dan a compulsive liar, me a bitter sister inventing stories. Marcus objected 17 times in an hour, and the judge sustained most of them. But they kept pushing, trying to make the jury doubt everything. After my testimony, 2 marshals rushed me out a side door, into a black SUV. They'd intercepted communications, a hit ordered on both Dan and me by a syndicate member still on the run. They drove me to a new safe house 3 states away. I spent the next month staring at beige walls, trying to work on my laptop, my concentration shattered. My boss called, but we both knew I couldn't keep missing deadlines. My aunt emailed screenshots of family Facebook posts calling me heartless for not helping Dan. Cousins said real family wouldn't involve courts and police. Half of them supported me, but the other half thought I should just give Dan money. Rachel took the stand 2 weeks into the trial with boxes of evidence. She walked the jury through bank records, proving he took $800,000 from Dad's estate, $400,000 from elderly clients at his old job, $300,000 from family friends who trusted him with investments, plus everything from my accounts. The prosecutors gasped when she said the total reached nearly $2 million. Even Dan's own lawyer looked genuinely shocked. James called me that night. 3 syndicate members arrested in other states wanted to make deals. They'd testify about the organization's structure. Dan's recordings, James said, were like dominoes falling. Each piece of evidence leading to more arrests, more people willing to talk, to save themselves. 2 weeks later, the Marshal Service set up a secure video call with Dan. The screen flickered, and there he was, in some plain room, no windows. He'd lost weight. His face looked older, like he'd aged 5 years in months. Dark circles under his eyes, but they weren't darting around anymore. He started talking right away. How sorry he was, how he never meant for things to go this far, how gambling got its hooks in him, he couldn't stop. I told him I was glad he was still breathing, but that didn't mean I forgave him. The call lasted 10 minutes before the marshals cut it off. 4 months after Dan stole everything, the syndicate trial reached its verdict. Federal court. I sat in the back row as the judge read guilty on every single count for all 17 members they'd caught. Sentences ranged from 10 years for the lower guys to life without parole for the 3 at the top who'd ordered hits. The judge thanked me and Dan by name, said our testimony was crucial to getting justice. Marcus squeezed my shoulder, but I just felt empty inside. Like winning didn't fix what was broken. With the syndicate finally locked up, the FBI told me I could leave witness protection, go back to my regular life. Except nothing about my life felt regular anymore. Marcus helped me with the mountain of paperwork to recover what money they could find. It would take months, and I'd probably never see all of it, but at least I could start rebuilding. I drove out to Forest Hill Cemetery on a cold Tuesday morning. It was the first time I'd visited Dad's grave since this whole mess started. I brushed dead leaves off his headstone, sat on the cold ground. And I just talked to him. I told him everything. About Dan forging the will, about the theft, the syndicate, the trial, how incredibly scared I'd been. I told him I'd protected what he left me, but I couldn't save Dan from himself. The cemetery was quiet, just the lonely calls of crows in the trees. 3 days later, I was back in the courthouse for Dan's sentencing. He stood there in his orange jumpsuit reading a statement about his gambling addiction. How it started. With $20 bets and turned into owing hundreds of thousands to dangerous people. He accepted responsibility, asked for mercy. Judge Hayes sentenced him to 10 years, with a possibility of parole in 7 if he stayed clean. They'd put him in a special witness protection unit in federal prison, where the syndicate couldn't reach him. When it was my turn for the victim impact statement, I walked to the podium and looked right at Dan. I talked about losing more than just money, my sense of safety, my trust in family, my belief that blood actually meant something. I said my brother died the day he forged that will. The man in orange was a stranger wearing his face. Dan put his head down. His shoulders shook like he was crying. A week after the sentencing, I finally went back to Dad's house to get it, ready to sell. Everything felt wrong there. Knowing Dan had bugged the place, that he'd watched me from outside. Every room now held memories of betrayal, not family. I called an estate sale company and told them to handle everything. I just couldn't stand being in those rooms anymore. Rachel came by my apartment with her final report in a thick folder. She'd traced and recovered about $750,000, but $400,000 was gone forever, probably spent on gambling debts or hidden in accounts we'd never find. After all the legal fees and expenses, I'd end up with about $500,000. Less than Dad wanted me to have, but enough to start over. She'd done everything she could, never giving up. I thanked her. A month into his sentence, a letter arrived. From Dan. 10 pages of his messy handwriting, detailing every lie he'd told since we were kids. Every theft, every manipulation, every time he blamed me for something he did. Stealing my birthday money when I was 8, telling Mom and Dad I was sneaking out when it was him, taking Dad's watch collection and selling it piece by piece while Dad was sick. He wrote that he needed me to know the whole truth, even if I could never forgive him. Reading it felt like drowning and breathing at the same time. My therapist helped me process the letter. Dan was trying to make amends, she said. The only way he could from prison. I didn't have to forgive him, or even respond, but acknowledging his effort might help me move forward. I decided to write back just once to tell him I got his letter and was working on healing. 5 months later, Tom called. He wanted to help me go through the last boxes of Dad's things still stored in his garage. We spent that Saturday sorting through old photo albums and paperwork. Then Tom pulled out a small box labeled "For My Kids" in Dad's handwriting. Inside, 2 USB drives with our names on them. Tom plugged mine into his laptop, and Dad's face filled the screen, recorded just weeks before he died. He looked tired, but he smiled. Told me how proud he was of the woman I'd become, how he knew I'd take care of the house. Then he mentioned hoping Dan would finally get help for his gambling problem. Tom played Dan's video next. We sat there, stunned, as Dad begged him to stop betting, saying he'd noticed money missing from his accounts but still loved him anyway. The estate sale 2 weeks later turned into something bigger. Buyers started recognizing items they'd already bought from Dan, months before Dad even died. One woman returned Dad's military medals, which she'd paid Dan $200 for, refusing to keep them once she learned they were stolen. Another man returned an antique pocket watch collection, worth thousands, that Dan had sold him claiming it was his inheritance. By the end of that day, we'd recovered 14 items Dan had stolen and sold, each one a stark reminder of his desperation. Rachel helped me use part of the recovered money to set up a scholarship fund at Dad's old college, naming it after him, to create something good from all this mess. The university asked me to speak about Dad's legacy at their spring ceremony. That same week, my boss called with unexpected news. A senior position opened in our Seattle office, a A promotion if I could relocate by summer. I accepted immediately. I desperately needed to get away from this city, where every street corner reminded me of betrayal and loss. 3 days before I listed the house, Dan called from prison. His face was thinner, but calmer. He talked about his therapy sessions, how his therapist was helping him understand why he'd always taken from others, how gambling started as excitement but turned into an uncontrollable desperation. I listened, not responding much. I wanted to believe he could change. But I knew I couldn't risk trusting him again. The house sold in just 2 weeks to a young couple with 3 kids. They loved the big backyard, Dad's workshop. Watching them measure rooms, talk about painting the kitchen yellow, I felt both sad and relieved. New memories would replace the old ones there. While packing for Seattle, I found the watch Dan had tried to leave me in his fake will. The emotional keepsake worth $50. It was actually Dad's favorite Omega. He'd worn it every day for 30 years, worth more in memories than money. I wrapped it carefully, put it in my carry-on, taking back its meaning from Dan's twisted gesture. Marcus called that night with news that solidified the depth of Dan's crimes. Dan's accomplice had agreed to testify about 3 other elderly clients of Dad's accounting firm that Dan had approached with investment scams after Dad died. 2 had been suspicious, but 1 had almost given Dan $50,000 before her daughter intervened. This wasn't an isolated incident, Marcus said. It was a pattern, a bigger plan. The scholarship ceremony at Dad's college felt like the first truly positive thing in months. I stood at the podium, talking about his integrity and generosity. I never mentioned Dan or the trial. I focused on how Dad had helped dozens of small business owners with free tax advice. The first scholarship recipient was a young woman named Maria, studying social work, planning to counsel gambling addicts. Strangely appropriate. My last therapy session before the move focused on something I hadn't expected: forgiving myself for not seeing Dan's problems sooner. My therapist gently reminded me that trusting family wasn't weakness. Dan's choices were his alone, not failures on my part for believing in him. 2 days before my move, I was packing when the TV caught my attention, breaking news about the syndicate Dan testified against. The reporter explained how Dan's testimony helped solve 3 murders from 5 years ago, giving closure to families who'd been waiting for answers. I sat on my half-packed couch, watching interviews with crying relatives thanking the prosecution, team, and their key witness: my brother, the thief who stole everything from me. But somehow, he'd helped other families find peace. Tom threw me a going-away party that night, filling his backyard with people who'd stood by me. My aunt, who'd initially defended Dan, didn't show up, nor did the cousins who thought I was being too harsh. But the people who mattered were there, raising glasses to my fresh start in Seattle. The drive to Seattle took 3 days. On the second day, I stopped for gas in Montana, right next to a casino, flashing lights, even from the highway. I walked inside, just to see what had grabbed Dan so hard. The moment I stepped through those doors, the sounds hit me like a physical wall. Bells ringing, machines beeping, people hunched over slots, feeding in bill after bill. The whole place felt designed to trap you. No windows, free drinks appearing constantly, and for the first time, I truly understood how someone already hurting could lose themselves completely in that artificial world of false hope. I left after 10 minutes, drove 6 hours straight. My first night in the Seattle apartment, still surrounded by boxes, Marcus called. News that made me drop the pizza slice I was eating. Dan had been attacked in prison, despite protective custody. Someone connected to the syndicate had gotten to him during a transfer. Broke 3 of his ribs, his nose. Guards pulled them off. Marcus said they were moving him to an even more secure facility. Part of me felt nothing, like my emotions for Dan had finally just shut off. But another part felt sick, thinking about him bleeding on a prison floor. A week later, I started my new job at a marketing firm downtown. I was just another transplant from the Midwest, I told my new coworkers. My father had passed. Nothing else. Nobody knew about Dan, or the trial, or the theft. Nobody looked at me with pity or judgment. For the first time in months, I could just be a normal person building a career. The anonymity felt like shedding a heavy coat I'd worn for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like without it. 2 weeks into the job, James called. His voice had that careful tone that always meant bad news. One of the syndicate members had escaped during a hospital transfer, faked chest pains. James insisted they didn't think I was in danger. The guy was probably fleeing the country, but I should stay aware of my surroundings. The fear I thought I'd left in Milwaukee came rushing back. I double-checked my apartment locks, looked over my shoulder walking to work. Seattle suddenly felt less like a safe new start, and more like a place where I was alone if something went wrong. Rachel sent her final invoice the next day, paid in full, stamped in red. A handwritten note. My father would be proud of your courage. She'd recovered more money than anyone thought possible. Never gave up, even when the trail went cold. I framed her note, hung it in my apartment. A reminder that some people keep their word. 2 weeks into Seattle life, I joined a hiking group. On our first trail up Rattlesnake Ledge, I told them I was from Milwaukee and my father had recently passed. Nothing else. The simplicity of that truth without Dan's crimes, hanging over it felt like freedom. Just being someone working through normal grief. We hiked for 3 hours. Nobody asked for details. Just offered sympathy, changed the subject to the beautiful view. 3 days later, James called again, his voice lighter, almost cheerful. The escaped syndicate member had been caught at the Mexican border, clearly running, not hunting. James officially closed my file. After 7 months of looking over my shoulder, I was completely safe, finally free to live my life without fear. 8 months after Dan first emptied my accounts, Marcus forwarded me a letter from Dan, vetted for legal issues. Dan wrote that he'd arranged to donate his prison work earnings to gambling addiction programs. Not much money, he admitted, but he wanted to do something. His letter ended with one line that made me pause, standing in my Seattle kitchen with rain hitting the windows. 3 weeks later, an FBI agent called. They'd recovered the last box of Dad's stuff from Dan's storage unit. I drove to the federal building downtown. The agent handed me a cardboard box that smelled like dust and old paper. Inside, Dad's coin collection, his military medals wrapped in tissue, photo albums I thought were gone forever. I picked up Dad's purple heart, felt its weight. The agent said Dan had tried to sell these things to a pawn shop, but the owner got suspicious and called the cops. Back in my apartment, I spread everything out on the kitchen table. The coins Dad collected since he was 12. His service photos from Vietnam. Pictures of him and Mom on their wedding day. Dan hadn't just stolen money. He tried to steal our whole family history. But he failed. These things survived. They came back to me. That night, I typed a letter to Dan. Not long, just a few sentences. Acknowledging his letters, his efforts to change. I wrote that I hoped he'd succeed in turning his life around. But we could never be family again. This was goodbye. I printed it, signed it, mailed it the next morning. The weight that lifted off my shoulders felt like dropping a 100-pound backpack I'd been carrying for months. 2 months later, Tom called. He was coming to Seattle for a conference, wanted to see me. He showed up at my apartment with a small box. Inside was Dad's watch, the one Dan had stolen and pawned. Tom had tracked it down through 3 different pawn shops, paid too much to get it back. He'd had it cleaned, repaired, engraved on the back. Integrity survives. We drove out to the pier at sunset, with a small urn of Dad's ashes I'd kept. We stood at the railing, watching the water turn gold and orange. We opened the urn. Together, let Dad's ashes scatter into Puget Sound. Seagulls called overhead. Tom put his hand on my shoulder. Dad would be proud, he said. You survived everything Dan put you through. We stayed until the last bit of light faded from the sky. On the 1-year anniversary of Dan emptying my accounts, I took the money from selling Dad's house and used it to start a family financial abuse prevention program through a local nonprofit. The director, a woman who'd been through something similar, told me most victims never get justice. She said my story gave other survivors hope, that they could fight back and win. We set up workshops, support groups, a hotline. 6 months. After that, I met someone new at work. Michael. Quiet, steady. He never pushed when I didn't want to talk. When he finally asked about my family over lunch, I just said my father had passed, and I was estranged from my brother. He nodded, changed the subject to weekend hiking plans. Over the next few months, we went on those hikes, had dinners. Slowly, I let him into my life. Trust wasn't dead, just very careful now. Marcus sent an update about Dan, therapy, NA meetings in prison, teaching other inmates to read. He wrote that Dan seemed genuinely committed to changing this time. I read the letter once, filed it, didn't respond. Dan's redemption was his journey, not mine to watch or help with. The gambling addiction support group sent me a thank you card, signed by 20 people. 3 families had sought help before hitting crisis after hearing my story. One woman wrote that her brother entered treatment because of what happened to me. Some good had come from the nightmare after all. On what would have been Dad's 70th birthday, I walked down to the pier at sunset, wearing his restored watch. The water was calm, mountains clear. I told him about the scholarship recipients, the families helped by the prevention program, all the people who'd found strength in our story. I whispered that I'd protected what really mattered, and his integrity had survived through me. The watch caught the last light as I turned to walk home. 2 years after that morning, I found my account's empty. A letter arrived from the first scholarship recipient, graduating, planning to counsel gambling addicts. She wrote that my father's legacy lived on through everyone he was helping, even though he was gone. I framed her letter, hung it next to Rachel's note and Dad's photo on my living room wall. In my Seattle apartment, with its view of the water, surrounded by new friends and Michael, who'd become more than just someone I was careful with. I'd built something Dan couldn't steal. My life wasn't defined by betrayal anymore. It was defined by what I'd done with the pieces afterward. The brother who forged our father's will was in prison. Maybe getting better, maybe not. But definitely gone from my world. I wasn't his victim. I wasn't just his sister. I was just myself. Finally free.